Nobody in that hangar knew what was coming. Not the colonel with his shiny new F-35 and his shinier new ego, standing there in a flight suit so crisp it still had crease lines from the packaging. Not the young pilots who laughed along because laughing along was easier than thinking for themselves, easier than risking the colonel's attention landing somewhere uncomfortable. Not even Renata, not really, not yet, though some old instinct in the back of her skull was already humming low, the way it always did before a mission that mattered more than the paperwork suggested. She just knew one thing with total certainty, the kind of certainty that doesn't come from evidence but from years of watching this exact valley breathe. In 6 hours, over a scar of dirt and rock nobody back home could find on a map, that ugly gray jet was going to save every single one of their lives. The base was called Kandahar Forward, though nobody called it that anymore. Everyone just called it the Rock because that's what it felt like most days, a hard gray stone sitting in the middle of nowhere, baking under a sun that didn't care who lived or died beneath it, that rose the same way every morning whether men came home or didn't. Renata had been flying the A-10 Thunderbolt for 6 years. 6 years of dust in her teeth and engine noise in her bones. 6 years of learning the particular grammar of a jet that had never once been built to look pretty. Everyone called it the Warthog because that's exactly what it looked like. A snub-nosed brute of a jet built around a 30mm cannon the size of a Volkswagen, a machine that seemed almost embarrassed by its own bluntness and didn't care in the slightest. Colonel Delacroix had arrived 3 weeks earlier, fresh off a promotion, trailing a reputation like exhaust smoke that never quite cleared behind him. He flew the F-35 Lightning, a jet worth more than the entire A-10 squadron combined, a jet that gleamed under the hangar lights like something built for a magazine cover rather than a war zone. He talked about stealth technology the way other men talked about their children, with a pride that bordered on tenderness, listing specifications the way a proud father lists his kid's report card. He genuinely believed, down in his bones, in the marrow where certainty calcifies into something almost religious, that anything without a glass cockpit and a $500 million price tag was a relic, a leftover from a war that modern pilots had already won in their sleep, back when men still trusted machines more than instinct. He mocked the warthogs every chance he got in briefings in the mess hall, standing near the flight line with his arms crossed like a man reviewing livestock he had no intention of purchasing. He mocked their slow speed, comparing them once to a school bus trying to outrun a sports car. He mocked their loud engines, their blunt, unglamorous shape, the way the whole airframe seemed built by someone who had simply stopped caring about elegance halfway through the design process. He mocked the pilots who flew them, calling them truck drivers, calling them dinosaurs, calling them anything that made his own jet sound sharper, faster, cleaner by comparison, anything that let him stand a little taller in a room full of people he'd only known for 3 weeks. Renata absorbed every word without flinching, without giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. She had learned a long time ago, somewhere over a different valley on a different deployment, that men who needed to insult other people's aircraft usually hadn't flown into real trouble yet. She had, twice, and both times it hadn't been a fast jet that brought her home. That morning, the briefing room smelled like burnt coffee and nervous sweat, the particular smell of too many bodies packed into too small a space too early in the day. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everyone's face in the same flat, unflattering gray. A joint patrol was heading into the Shomali corridor, a narrow valley pinched between 2 ridgelines, thick with old Soviet trenches and newer, worse surprises buried underneath them. Surprises that had a way of surfacing exactly when nobody expected them to. Ground command wanted air cover, standard rotation, nothing dramatic, the kind of routine mission that fills most of a deployment without anyone ever writing home about it. Delacroix volunteered his flight of F-35s for the job before anyone else could speak, his hand already halfway up before the briefing officer had finished the sentence. He wanted the mission on his record. He wanted it clean, fast, and photogenic, the kind of story that would look good in a promotion packet years down the line. Renata raised her hand anyway, calm and unhurried, the way she did everything. She requested a support slot, low altitude, holding pattern 20 miles east, the exact position she'd flown a dozen times before without incident, without fanfare, without anyone particularly noticing. Delacroix smirked at her across the room, a look that carried more contempt than the words that followed it. "You want to babysit," he said, letting the words sit there, ugly and deliberate, while the real work gets done. A few pilots snickered, quick nervous laughter that died just as fast once they realized the room hadn't fully laughed with them. Renata just nodded once, calm as still water, her face giving away absolutely nothing. She had flown that valley 11 times before. She knew things about it that weren't written on any map, things you only learn by flying low and slow and paying attention while everyone else is busy going fast, busy trusting screens over instinct. Nobody asked her what those things were. Nobody ever did. That was the strange curse of flying the ugliest jet in the fleet, a curse she had long since stopped resenting and simply learned to live inside. People assumed slow meant simple, assumed loud meant clumsy, assumed old meant obsolete, as though speed alone could substitute for understanding. They never stopped to ask why the Warthog had survived every single attempt to retire it for the last 40 years, why budget committees kept trying to kill the program and kept failing year after year, decade after decade. They never wondered why grunts on the ground, the ones actually bleeding in the dirt, the ones who mattered most in any honest accounting of a war, always asked for the hog by name over the radio and never asked for anything else. Not once, not in 6 years of Renata listening to those requests come crackling through her headset. The patrol lifted off just after 600, engines screaming into a sky the color of a fresh bruise, purple bleeding into orange along the eastern horizon. Delacroix's flight climbed fast and clean, 4 sleek shapes vanishing into altitude like they had somewhere better to be, contrails already forming thin white lines against the darkening blue above them. Renata's flight lifted off 8 minutes later, low and slow, hugging the terrain the way a mother hugs a child crossing a busy street, close enough to feel every dip and rise of the ground passing beneath the fuselage. Her wingman, a quiet lieutenant named Marcus Ibe, keyed his mic once they leveled off, static crackling faintly in her ear before his voice came through. "You good, Captain?" She didn't answer right away. She was already watching the valley, eyes moving in the slow, methodical sweep she'd trained into herself over 1,000 hours of exactly this kind of flying. The Shomali corridor unfolded beneath them like a scar across the earth, brown and jagged, split by a dry riverbed that hadn't seen water in a decade, its cracked bed twisting between the ridgelines like something reptilian. Mud compounds dotted the ridgelines, abandoned or occupied, nobody ever really sure which until it was too late to matter, their walls the same dusty color as the hillsides around them, deliberately or accidentally camouflaged by decades of neglect. Renata dropped altitude further, skimming just above the ridgeline, close enough to count individual rooftops, close enough to notice the things that mattered, the small human details that vanished entirely at higher altitudes. The goat herd scattering wrong, breaking in a pattern that didn't match wind or weather. A door swinging open with nobody visible behind it, creaking on a hinge she could almost imagine hearing. Small things. The kind of things fast jets never see, not because their pilots weren't skilled, but because their altitude simply erased the details that mattered most. Up above, Delacroix's flight cruised at 25,000 feet, sensors sweeping, screens glowing green and orderly inside 4 pristine cockpits, everything reduced to clean geometric shapes on a digital display. From up there, the valley looked like a diagram, clean lines and clear shapes, everything simplified into something a computer could categorize and file neatly away as either threat or non-threat, with no room left over for the uncertain, unquantifiable spaces in between. He radioed the ground unit below with total confidence, his voice smooth and untroubled, the voice of a man who had never once had to eat his own words in front of an audience. "All clear, corridor looks quiet, proceed as planned." He said it the way men say things when they've never once been wrong, loudly enough to remember the feeling, the way certainty sounds when it has never been properly tested against reality. The ground convoy rolled forward on his word, engines grinding low in first gear over uneven ground. 6 vehicles, 22 soldiers, moving slow through the dry riverbed with the particular caution of men who had learned the hard way that quiet valleys lie, that silence in this part of the world was rarely a gift and often a warning nobody had decoded yet. Renata watched them from above, watched the dust kick up behind their tires in slow golden clouds, watched the goat herd still scattered wrong along the eastern ridge, still refusing to settle back into their normal grazing pattern. Something in her stomach turned over slowly, the way it always did right before something terrible decided to introduce itself, a feeling she'd learned never to argue with, only to listen to. "Ibe," she said, her voice flat and even, betraying nothing of the tightening in her chest. "Something's wrong with that eastern ridgeline." Her lieutenant scanned the same terrain through his own canopy and saw nothing but rock and shadow, ordinary hillside baking under an ordinary morning sun. "I don't see it, Captain." Neither did the sensors up above, the ones Delacroix trusted with his entire career, the ones that had never once let him down in a way he was willing to admit. Renata trusted something older and less explainable, a pattern recognition built from 11 passes through this exact valley, from years of watching how frightened animals move, from knowing what silence sounds like right before it breaks, a silence with a texture to it, almost a weight. She dropped lower still, against every instinct that told her a slow-moving jet at low altitude was a target waiting to happen, against every piece of doctrine that said altitude equals safety. The riverbed compound slid past beneath her canopy, close enough now that she could see individual stones stacked into low walls, could see the mortar crumbling between them from years of weather and neglect. And then she saw it. A shape under a tarp behind one of those walls, angular, too angular, the straight lines wrong against the natural chaos of the rock around it, catching the morning light in a way that rock never does, a dull metallic glint that lasted less than a second but burned itself into her vision anyway. Her blood went cold and very, very still, a stillness that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with recognition. "Ground unit, this is Warthog 1, she called, her voice sharpening into something new, something that cut through every radio channel it touched, stripped suddenly of its earlier flatness. "I have a probable ambush position, Eastern Ridge, 300 meters north of your position. Hold your advance immediately." There was a pause on the other end, a particular pause of men deciding whether to trust a voice they couldn't see, weighing years of drilled discipline against the sudden urgency in her tone. Then the convoy commander's voice crackled back, tight and fast, brakes already audible in the background. "Copy, Warthog 1, holding position." Up above, Delacroix's voice cut in over the joint channel, irritated and dismissive, laced with the particular impatience of a man being questioned by someone he'd already decided didn't matter. "Warthog 1, my sensors show clear. Do not delay this convoy on a hunch." Renata didn't argue. Arguing cost time, and time was the one thing she suddenly didn't have to spare. She simply banked harder into the valley, dropping another 500 feet, close enough now that she could hear her own engines echoing off the canyon walls, a deep growling roar bouncing back at her from stone that had stood there for 1,000 years. And that's when the tarp moved, not from wind, from hands, human hands pulling it back with deliberate, practiced motion, revealing exactly what she already knew was underneath it. It was a heavy machine gun position, dug into the hillside, camouflaged with a patience that had clearly been waiting for the wrong target to wander close enough, sandbags stacked in a neat defensive crescent around the weapon's base. Behind it, further up the slope, she caught the glint of something worse, a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, angled toward the exact bend in the riverbed the convoy was about to round, positioned with a precision that spoke of careful planning rather than opportunistic chance. This wasn't a stray patrol stumbling into contact. This was a planned kill zone built to swallow a column of American vehicles whole in a matter of seconds, and Delacroix's sensors, cruising 5 miles high, glowing green and confident, had walked right past it without so much as a flicker of warning. "Contact, contact, contact," Renata called, her voice suddenly sharp as broken glass, cutting through every other transmission on the channel. "Eastern Ridge, multiple fighting positions, RPG and heavy machine gun, convoy is inside the engagement radius." The machine gun opened up before she even finished the sentence, tracers arcing down toward the stalled convoy in ugly orange streaks, each round tearing through the morning air with a sound like tearing fabric amplified 1,000 times over. Soldiers scrambled for cover behind vehicles never designed to stop that kind of fire, diving into the dry riverbed, pressing themselves flat against dust and stone. Somewhere down there, 22 young men suddenly understood exactly how close death had crept while nobody was looking, a realization that arrives all at once and never gently. Delacroix's flight was too high, too fast, too committed to a different pattern to react in time, their jets built for speed and distance rather than the tight, immediate violence the moment demanded. Their sleek aircraft needed room to turn, distance to line up, altitude to convert into a diving strike, precious seconds that simply didn't exist anymore. All of that took time nobody had. Renata didn't have that problem. She was already there, already low, already turning the Warthog's nose into the ridgeline like she'd been rehearsing this exact moment her entire career, every muscle in her body moving with an economy that came from years of repetition. Because in a way, she had. "I'd stay high, cover my egress," she said, her voice utterly calm now, the calm of someone who had stopped being afraid the moment fear stopped being useful, the moment fear became just another distraction to be filed away and dealt with later. She rolled the jet hard, the horizon spinning briefly in her canopy, lined up on the machine gun nest, and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon under her cockpit roared to life, a sound like the sky itself tearing open, a deep bone-shaking rumble that swallowed every other noise in the valley, 3,900 rounds a minute chewing through rock and sandbags and everything hiding behind them, turning stone into dust and dust into smoke. The recoil shuddered through the entire airframe, a violence that fast jets simply weren't built to survive, the whole aircraft momentarily slowing under the sheer mechanical force of its own weapon. But the Warthog had been built around exactly this moment, engineered from the nose backwards specifically to deliver this kind of devastating, close, ugly, effective violence, a design philosophy that valued brute reliability over grace. The machine gun position vanished in a cloud of dust and debris, sandbags and shredded tarp thrown skyward before raining back down. The tracers stopped. For one suspended second, the whole valley went silent, as if even the mountains were holding their breath to see what came next, the silence so complete it felt almost louder than the cannon fire that had just filled it. "Convoy, you are clear to advance. Repeat, position is neutralized," Renata called, banking hard to reacquire the RPG team still scrambling further up the slope, her eyes already tracking movement through the dust. Below her, the convoy commander's voice came back, ragged with disbelief and gratitude tangled together into something that didn't have a name, something raw and unfiltered by military discipline. "Copy, Warthog 1, we owe you our lives." She didn't answer that. There wasn't time to answer that. She was already lining up her second pass because the job wasn't finished, and finished was the only thing that mattered right now. The RPG team broke cover and ran, scrambling up loose scree with the desperate speed of men who understood exactly what was circling above them, which was in its own terrible way the smartest decision they made all day. Running men are hard for fast jets to track and even harder for them to hit at this altitude, their small shapes vanishing against broken terrain that would confuse a targeting computer built for larger, cleaner signatures. But Renata wasn't at that altitude. She was low, slow, and turning tight, exactly the things Delacroix had mocked 20 minutes earlier in front of the entire squadron, exactly the things that let her track two fleeing shapes through broken terrain that would have swallowed a faster jet's targeting solution whole and spat out nothing useful in return. Warthog 1, danger close, I say again danger close, Ibe warned from above, his voice tight with concern as he watched her fly closer to the convoy's position than any sane targeting manual recommended. Close enough that the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Renata didn't slow down. Danger close wasn't a wall, it was a warning label, and warning labels existed to be respected, not obeyed blindly by pilots too scared to trust their own eyes and their own years of training. She fired a second burst, shorter this time, precise, controlled, the cannon's roar cutting off almost as quickly as it began, and the RPG team simply stopped existing in the way that violence sometimes ends things without ceremony, without drama, just an abrupt and final silence where movement had been a moment before. By the time Delacroix's flight finally arced back around into position, engines still working to shed the altitude and speed that had cost them everything, the fight was already over. His sensors, so proud, so expensive, so certain, showed him a battlefield that had already been decided by a jet he'd mocked in front of the entire squadron 3 hours earlier. Decided in the space of maybe 90 seconds while his own aircraft were still turning. He keyed his mic, voice tight with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite shame, though it was uncomfortably close to both, the kind of voice that comes out flat when a man is working very hard to control it. Warthog 1, status report. Renata's voice came back level, almost bored, betraying nothing of the adrenaline still working through her system. Threat neutralized, convoy is moving again, Colonel. Nobody spoke for a long moment after that. Not Delacroix, sitting 5 miles up in a cockpit suddenly feeling less impressive than it had that morning. Not the pilots who had laughed along with him earlier, now quiet on the same channel that had carried their laughter. Not even the ground troops, who were too busy checking each other for wounds they'd somehow avoided by seconds, running hands over arms and chests in the particular disbelieving way of men confirming they were still whole. The silence stretched out over the radio channel like something physical, heavy, undeniable. The kind of silence that happens when a joke suddenly becomes a lie everyone in the room had believed a little too easily, a silence that seemed to hang in the air of the entire valley long after the engines had faded. The convoy rolled forward through the smoking wreckage of the ambush position, past scorched sandbags and scattered debris, 22 men who had woken up that morning assuming it might be their last, the way soldiers always assume without quite admitting it to themselves, now driving past evidence that it very nearly had been. One of them, a young sergeant barely out of his teens, his face still pale under a layer of dust, looked up through his windshield at the ugly gray jet circling protectively above and did something he would later admit felt strange in the moment, something that surprised even him. He saluted an aircraft, not a person. A machine that had somehow felt like a person anyway, felt like a guardian angel wrapped in aluminum and painted a color nobody had ever called beautiful. Back at base, the debrief happened in a different room than usual, one with better lighting and worse tension, the kind of room reserved for conversations that mattered more than routine. Delacroix sat at the head of the table, jaw set, staring at a printout of the mission data like it might rearrange itself into a story he liked better, his fingers tapping a slow, uneven rhythm against the table's edge. Renata sat across from him, helmet on the table beside her, hands folded, saying nothing until someone asked her a direct question, her posture relaxed in a way that made the tension in the room even more obvious by contrast. She had learned that lesson long before this mission. Say what's necessary. Let the results argue the rest, because results rarely needed her help to make their point. Your sensors called it clear, she finally said, when the silence had gone on long enough that someone had to break it, her voice quiet but perfectly clear in the stillness of the room. Mine called it low altitude, patience, and about 100 hours logged flying that exact valley until I knew what wrong looked like. She wasn't gloating. There was no satisfaction in her voice at all, only a tired kind of clarity, the clarity of someone who has just watched a lesson get taught the hardest possible way and would have preferred it never needed teaching in the first place, would have preferred a quiet morning and a boring debrief over any of this. Delacroix didn't respond right away. Something in his face had shifted since that morning, some certainty had cracked and hadn't yet decided what would grow in the gap it left behind, a visible unmooring that no amount of rank could disguise. He had built his entire identity around speed, altitude, and technology, around the comforting idea that newer always meant better and faster always meant safer, an idea that had served him well enough in briefings and promotion boards but had just failed catastrophically against dust and rock, and a pilot willing to fly close enough to actually see the truth. Today, an aircraft designed in the 1970s, flown low and slow by a pilot he'd openly mocked, had just quietly proven that idea wrong in front of 22 witnesses who would never forget it, witnesses who would tell this story for years after they'd forgotten most other details of the deployment. News of the mission spread through the base faster than any official report could move, carried by word of mouth through chow lines and smoke breaks and the particular grapevine that exists on every forward operating base regardless of how remote it is. By evening, the story had already grown legs of its own, told and retold in the mess hall over trays of reconstituted eggs, in the maintenance bay under the glow of work lights, in the crowded little gym where off-duty soldiers worked out their nervous energy on equipment held together with duct tape and stubbornness. The details shifted slightly with every telling, the way stories always do, gaining color and losing precision in equal measure, but the core of it stayed exactly the same, unshakable no matter how many times it passed from mouth to mouth. The colonel laughed at the warthog. Then the warthog saved everyone. Marcus Ibe found Renata later that night, sitting alone on the hood of a parked Humvee, staring up at a sky finally dark enough to hide its secrets again, stars scattered thick overhead in a way they never were back home. He handed her a lukewarm coffee without a word and sat down beside her, the metal of the hood still faintly warm from the day's heat beneath them. "You knew," he said eventually, his voice quiet, almost hesitant, not a question. "Just a statement, spoken quietly, the way you speak about something that still feels too large to say too loudly, something that still hadn't quite settled into an ordinary shape yet." "I had a feeling," she corrected him, taking a slow sip of coffee that had gone lukewarm an hour ago. "Feelings aren't proof, they're just where you start looking." She thought about that valley a lot over the following days, replaying it in the quiet moments before sleep, the way the light had caught that tarp wrong, the exact angle and color of it, the way the goats had scattered in a pattern that didn't match wind or weather, a pattern she still couldn't fully articulate even to herself. None of that showed up on any sensor readout, no matter how sophisticated. None of it could be quantified into a targeting solution or a probability score, reduced to numbers a computer could parse. It lived somewhere else entirely, in the accumulated weight of every flight before this one, every mistake survived and every lesson paid for in adrenaline and fear, in the particular clarity that only comes from having been wrong before and remembering exactly how that felt, a memory that never quite faded no matter how many missions piled up on top of it. 2 days later, Delacroix found her in the hangar, standing beside her jet while the maintenance crew patched a small hole in the wing's skin, a scar from a fight that hadn't touched the parts of the aircraft that actually mattered, sparks occasionally flying from a welding torch nearby. He stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, looking almost younger than he had that first morning, stripped of some certainty that had aged him falsely all along, some armor he'd been wearing so long he'd forgotten it wasn't actually part of him. "I was wrong," he said finally. 3 words, no excuses folded in around them, no qualifiers softening the edges. Just the plain, unadorned admission, harder for a man like him to say than any of the mockery had ever been to speak. Renata looked at him for a long moment before answering, studying his face the way she'd studied that ridgeline, patient and unhurried. She wasn't interested in humiliating him further, wasn't interested in collecting an apology like a trophy to display later to anyone who would listen. She had seen too many pilots die because pride outlasted good judgment, watched good men make fatal decisions simply because backing down felt worse than dying, and she had no interest in becoming the reason someone else's pride got dented past repair. "The jet doesn't care what you think of it," she said finally, her voice even and unhurried. "It just does the job, maybe try doing the same." He nodded slowly, and for the first time since he'd arrived, he actually seemed to hear her, really hear her, past the rank and the reputation and everything else standing between them. Word of the incident eventually reached higher command, filtered through official channels, stripped of the color and detail that made it worth telling in the first place, reduced to the flat bureaucratic language that swallows every good story whole. On paper, it became a single line in a mission summary, buried between logistics updates and fuel consumption reports. "Enemy ambush neutralized, 0 friendly casualties." The paperwork never mentioned the mockery, the silence, the way an entire base's opinion of an old aircraft shifted in the space of one radio call that lasted maybe 40 seconds from start to finish. Some stories are too honest for official records. They survive instead in the places records can't reach, told quietly over coffee, passed down until they harden into something like legend. Something told to new pilots not because it needs embellishing, but because it doesn't. The Warthog itself, the actual aircraft, sat parked in its usual spot the next morning, unglamorous, gray, patched, exactly as ugly as it had been the day Delacroix first mocked it, the morning sun catching the same dull paint and the same worn edges. Nothing about its appearance had changed. What had changed was harder to see and far more permanent, a quiet shift in the way people looked at it when they walked past, lingering a half-second longer than they used to, a small unspoken respect that no amount of mockery would ever fully erase again. Sometimes the ugliest things in the room are the only things built to survive what's actually coming, built not to impress anyone but simply to work reliably every single time it mattered. Renata never talked about that mission much afterward, not because she was modest, though she was, but because talking about it felt like it might somehow diminish the plain simplicity of what had actually happened, might dress it up in language it never needed. She had watched closely. She had trusted what her eyes told her over what a screen insisted, trusted years of accumulated experience over a display that could only ever show what it had been programmed to look for. She had flown low and slow into danger because that was exactly what the job required, and she had done it without needing anyone's permission or approval to know it was the right call, without waiting for someone else to confirm what she already understood in her gut. There's a particular kind of confidence that doesn't come from rank or reputation or the price tag stamped on your aircraft, a confidence that can't be bought or assigned, only earned one difficult hour at a time. It comes from doing the unglamorous work long enough that you stop needing anyone else's validation to trust your own judgment. From logging hour after hour of quiet, unremarkable flights, until the instincts they build become as reliable as anything written in a manual. Renata had that confidence. She'd earned it the hard way, through thousands of hours flying a jet everyone else considered obsolete, through years of proving, quietly and repeatedly without fanfare or recognition, that slow and ugly could still outthink fast and shiny when it mattered most, when lives were actually on the line instead of just reputations. Delacroix requested a familiarization flight in the back seat of a two-seat Warthog trainer 3 weeks later, a request that surprised absolutely nobody who had watched his face during that debrief, who had seen something in him quietly rearrange itself in the days since. He wanted to see the valley the way she saw it, low and close and honest, instead of the sanitized version his own sensors had handed him from 5 miles up, a version that had nearly gotten 22 men killed without ever registering a single warning. Renata agreed without hesitation, because teaching wasn't about winning an argument or savoring a victory. It was about making sure the next pilot who mocked something they didn't understand had at least tried to understand it first, had at least earned the right to their own opinion through first-hand experience. They flew that same corridor together on a quiet Tuesday morning, engines rattling the canopy glass, dust kicking up off the same dry riverbed below them. Delacroix said very little during the flight, watching the terrain scroll past close enough to touch, close enough that individual rocks and shadows resolved into detail he genuinely never noticed from higher altitude, watching Renata's hands move across the controls with the easy confidence of someone who had stopped being afraid of this particular kind of danger a long time ago. When they landed, the tires chirping once against the tarmac, he climbed out of the cockpit slower than usual, like a man recalibrating something fundamental about how he saw the world, testing his legs the way you test ice before trusting your full weight on it. "I get it now," he said, standing on the tarmac beside the jet he once compared to a museum piece, squinting against the sun as he looked it over with new eyes. "It's not slow, it's patient." Renata allowed herself a small smile at that, the first one anyone had seen from her in weeks, small and quiet but genuine. "Patient wins more fights than fast does," she said. "Fast just makes for better recruiting posters." He laughed at that, a real laugh, nothing like the loud performative one from 3 weeks earlier that had echoed off the hangar walls. This one had humility folded into it, quiet and a little self-deprecating, and that made all the difference in the world. The story of that ambush and the silence that followed the colonel's mockery spread beyond that single base eventually, the way good stories always do among people who understand what's actually at stake in the sky, passed along by pilots rotating out to new assignments and new squadrons. Young pilots training on Warthogs heard it during their own briefings, told by instructors who used it not to shame fast jet pilots or stoke old rivalries, but to remind everyone that no single aircraft holds a monopoly on being right, that every design carries its own strengths shaped by the missions it was built to fly. Every jet has a job it does better than anything else. The trick is respecting that instead of mocking what you don't fully understand, respecting it enough to at least ask why it's still flying after 40 years of people predicting its retirement. Renata kept flying that same valley for the rest of her deployment, low and slow, patient and watchful, exactly the way she always had, exactly the way that had never once let her down. She never mentioned the incident to new pilots unless they asked directly, and even then she kept the story short, stripped of drama, focused entirely on the lesson rather than the moment of vindication that it felt in the end, far less satisfying than simply watching that convoy roll home safely. She wasn't interested in being remembered as the pilot who proved a colonel wrong in front of an audience. She was interested in making sure the next convoy came home in one piece, and the one after that, and the one after that, quietly, mission after mission, for as long as she kept flying. There's something worth sitting with in a story like this one. Something beyond the satisfaction of watching arrogance meet its match in front of an audience that had laughed along only hours earlier. It's the reminder that the loudest opinion in the room is rarely the most reliable one, that experience earned in silence often outlasts confidence built on volume and a shiny paint job, and that the things we're quickest to mock are sometimes the very things that end up saving us when it matters most. Renata never needed the colonel's apology to know she was right. She just needed the convoy to make it home. It did. If this story pulled you in, you already know why pilots like her never needed to raise their voice to be heard. Stick around, because there are more stories exactly like this one waiting, quiet people proving loud people wrong in the moments that actually matter, and you won't want to miss what happens next.